Welcome to SKC, Sapna Kohli classes. This is part 2 of lesson number 1, A Triumph of Surgery from the book Footprints Without Feet. In part 1, we had read that Mrs. Humphrey is a rich and resourceful lady with a large number of servants and maids. She is passionately attached to her little pet dog Tricky. She is much worried about Tricky's miserable condition. Tricky has become hugely fat and listless. She thinks that Tricky is suffering from malnutrition, so she starts giving him malt, cod liver oil, and a bowl of Horlicks every day. The doctor, Mr. Harriet, knew that Tricky's only fault was his greed for food. He advises Mrs. Pumphrey to cut down food and sweets for Tricky. For Mrs. Pumphrey, it is very difficult because she pampers Tricky like a spoiled child. So, Mr. Harriet suggests that Tricky should be hospitalized and he takes Tricky to his surgery. Right? So, let's read the remaining part of the lesson. When they had finished, Tricky took a walk round the shining bowls, licking casually inside one or two of them. So here we are talking about the time when the dogs were fed by Tristan. At that time, there was a tough competition among the dogs to finish their meal fast because they knew that if they would lag behind, they would have to face competition from them. So when all the dogs had finished uh, their food, Tricky took a walk round the shining bowls, licking. So Tricky, he did not eat food that day. He only licked the leftover, which was inside one or two of them, because Tricky was not keeping well, and he was not eating anything. So he just licked one or two bowls. Next day, an extra bowl was put out for him. So next day, an extra bowl was kept for Tricky also. And I was pleased to see him jostling his way towards it. Now, the meaning of jostling. Jostling is pushing, right? So, next day, when it was a meal time, a bowl was kept for Tricky also, and Tricky could be seen jostling, pulling his way towards it. From then on, his progress was rapid. So his recovery was very rapid. Rapid here means it was very fast. He had no medical treatment of any kind, but all day he ran about with the dogs, joining in their friendly scrimmages. Now, the meaning of the word scrimmages is fights. So, in the surgery in Dr. Harriet's place, Tricky was given no medical treatment, right? All the day he was busy in physical activity. He ran about with the other dogs. He joined them in their friendly scrimmages, fights. He discovered the joys of being bowled over, tramped on, and squashed every minute. So he discovered the joys of being bowled over. So bowled over here means defeated, tramped on, tramped on. Now, tramped on here it means crushed and squashed. Squashed means damaged every few minutes. So, Tricky enjoyed with the other dogs, and sometimes he was defeated, he was crushed, he was squeezed with force by the other dogs. But he enjoyed all these things. He became an accepted member of the gang. So the other dogs accepted him as a member of their gang group, an unlikely, silky little object among the shaggy crew, fighting like a tiger for his share at meal times and hunting rats in the old hen house at night. He had never had such a time in his life. So the other dogs accepted him as a member of their group, an unlikely, silky little object among the shaggy crew. Shaggy hair means untidy, rough hair. Now, the meaning of this line is an unlikely, silky little object among the shaggy crew. So, crew means group. So the meaning of this line is that all the dogs accepted Tricky as a member of their group, although unlikely, although he was different from them, right? They all were very untidy. They all had long hair. So how was Tricky different? He was very well taken care of by his mistress, by his owner, Mrs. Pumphrey, right? Unlike the other dogs, right? Who were not so well looked after by their owners. So this is the meaning of these lines. Fighting like a tiger for his share at meal times. So Tricky used to fight at meal times for his share of food. Hunting rats in the old hen house at night. He enjoyed hunting rats with the other dogs. He had never had such a wonderful time in his life. All the while, Mrs. Pumphrey hovered anxiously in the background. Now, the meaning of the word hovered is hung over. So, Mrs. Pumphrey, all the time, she used to be there anxiously in the background, worried. So she used to hang around, and she was very worried about her dog in the background, ringing a dozen times a day for the latest bulletins. Bulletins here refers to news. So Mrs. Pumphrey, she was all the time worried about the well-being, health of her dog, and she used to ring Mr. Harriet almost a dozen times. A dozen is equal to 12. So a dozen times every day to inquire about Tricky's health. I dodged, here dodged means escaped. I dodged the questions about whether his cushions were being turned regularly or his correct coat worn according to the weather, but I was able to tell her that the fellow was out of danger and convalescing rapidly. Now, Mrs. Pumphrey used to ring a dozen times every day, but Mr. Harriet says that whenever she used to ask about whether his cushions were turned or not, correct quote was what he found these questions to be unnecessary. So he escaped. He dodged. He did not answer these questions, but he always told her that the little fellow means Tricky was out of danger and convalescing rapidly. Convalescing means he was recovering rapidly. His recovery was speedy. He was doing well there. The word convalescing seemed to do something to Mrs. Pumphrey. So Mr. Harriet said, the moment I told Mrs. Pumphrey that Tricky was recovering, his recovery was very speedy, it seemed to do something with Mrs. Pumphrey. She started to bring round fresh eggs, 2 dozen at a time, to build up Tricky's strength. So what happened when she heard that now Tricky had started keeping well, his recovery was good? She visited Mr. Harriet's house and she started bringing 2 dozen fresh eggs every day. Why? To build up Tricky's strength. For a happy period. For a happy period means for a good period of time, right? My partners and I means Mr. Harriet, had 2 eggs each for breakfast. But when the bottles of wine began to arrive, the real possibilities of the situation began to dawn on the household. The meaning of the word began to dawn means begin to understood or realize upon the household. Now see, the meaning of these lines is that when Mrs. Pumphrey started bringing 2 dozen eggs every day, these eggs were not given to Tricky. They were consumed by Mr. Harriet and his staff or partners right? They enjoyed eggs during breakfast, and then she also started bringing wine, and the real possibilities of the situation began to dawn on the household. Means the now Mr. Harriet realized that the situation of his household had started becoming good, because he was not as well off, as rich, as resourceful as Mrs. Pumphrey. So now he got an abundant supply of these things. So he and the other members in his household enjoyed all these things. It was to enrich Tricky's blood. Now, what is the meaning of these lines? It means Mrs. Pumphrey started bringing bottles of wine to improve here, enrich here. See the word enrich. So she started bringing bottles of wine to improve the quality of Tricky's blood, right? Lunch became a ceremonial occasion. Ceremonial occasion means a time for celebration. So Mr. Harriet says that lunchtime had become a ceremonial occasion, a time for celebration, with 2 glasses of wine before the lunch and several glasses during the meal. We could hardly believe it when the brandy came to put a final edge on Tricky's constitution. Now, the meaning of the word constitution is composition or body structure. So, Mr. Harriet says it was very uh, difficult for them to believe. It was unbelievable when Mrs. Pumphrey brought brandy. It came as a final edge to on Tricky's constitution, so to improve Tricky's composition, body structure. For a few nights, the fine spirit, so fine spirit here refers to the brandy, was rolled around, it was spread around, inhaled, breathed in, and reverently. Reverently means respectfully drunk. So this is, see, they had so much amount of brandy, bottles of brandy were brought by Mrs. Pumphrey that they said that we spilled some, we inhaled some, and we respectfully drank some bottles of brandy. They were days of deep content. Content means satisfaction. They were days. They were days means which days? The days when Tricky was in Mr. Harriet's house. Those days were days of deep satisfaction. Was starting well. Why were the days of deep satisfaction? Starting well with the extra egg in the morning, improved and sustained. Sustained means maintained by the midday wine, and finishing, ending luxuriously round the fire with the brandy. So their day began with egg, then they enjoyed wine during the midday in the afternoon, and then their day ended with brandy. So that is why he says that those were the days of deep content or satisfaction. It was a temptation. Temptation means attraction. It was a temptation to keep Tricky as a permanent guest. So Mr. Mr. Harriet, he felt tempted to keep Tricky as a permanent guest. Why? Because the days he spent in treating Tricky, they were the days of deep satisfaction. See, she used to send all the delicacies, drinks, right, for then we have already read eggs, wine, and brandy. They were all served quite liberally by Mrs. Pumphrey, and they were enjoyed by Mr. Harriet. That is why he was tempted to keep Tricky as a permanent guest. But I knew Mrs. Pumphrey was suffering, and after a fortnight felt compelled to phone and tell her that the dog had recovered and was awaiting collection. He said that I was feeling tempted that I should not send Tricky back home. I should keep him with me for some more days. But at the same time, I realized that his owner, Mrs. Pumphrey, was suffering without her dog. So after a fortnight, I felt compelled. So morally, I felt that I should call her. So I phoned her and I told her that her dog had recovered and that she could come and collect him any time. Within minutes, about 30, within minutes means when Mr. Harriet called Mrs. Pumphrey and asked her to take her dog, within minutes, about 30 feet of gleaming means shining, black metal drew up. Black metal here refers to black car drew up outside the surgery. So within minutes, outside surgery here refers to the clinic. So within minutes, Mrs. Pumphrey came in her black car to collect Tricky. A black car stopped outside Mr. Harriet's surgery. The chauffeur means the driver, opened the door and I could just make out the figure of Mrs. Pumphrey almost lost in the interior. So the driver opened the door of the car and I could see Mrs. Pumphrey sitting inside the car. Her hands were tightly clasped. Clasped means here joined. In front of her, her lips trembled. Oh, Mr. Harriet, do tell me the truth. Is he really better? Please, Mr. Harriet, please tell me, is my dog better now? Yes, he is fine. He refers to Tricky. Yes, he is fine. There is no need for you to get out of the car. I'll go and fetch him. Fetch him means I'll go and bring the dog. I refers to Mr. Harriet. He walked through the house into the garden. A mass of dogs. Mass means a large number of dogs. A mass of dogs was hurtling round and round. Hurtling here means moving, moving fast, moving round and round the lawn and in their midst. Midst means in their middle. Ears flapping. Flapping means waving. Tail waving was the little golden figure of Tricky. So when Mr. Harriet reached the garden, he saw that a group of dogs, they were moving round and round and Tricky was in the center and he was he was moving his ears and tail. In 2 weeks, he had been transformed. Transformed means changed into a lithe. Lithe means flexible. Into a lithe, hard-muscled animal. So, in 2 weeks' time only, Mr. Harriet had changed Tricky into a flexible and strong muscled animal. When he had brought Tricky to his surgery, Tricky was very fat and listless as well as motionless. He was keeping up well with the pack. He was keeping well with the other dogs. Pack means group of dogs. Stretching out. Stretching out means spreading out in great bounds, his chest almost brushing the ground. So he was stretching, he was spreading out, he was sort of exercise was being done by him in great bounds, and he was jumping along with the other dogs, and his chest almost brushing the ground, his chest almost touched the ground. I carried him back along the passage to the front of the house. So Mr. Harriet took Tricky to the front of the house. The chauffeur was still holding the car door open, and when Tricky saw his mistress, he took off from my arms in a tremendous means huge leap. Leap means jump, and sailed. Sailed means here ran fast into Mrs. Pumphrey's lap. The moment Tricky saw Mrs. Pumphrey, he jumped from Mr. Harriet's arms and ran quickly towards Mrs. Pumphrey. She gave a startled. Startled means amazed. Startled, amazed, oh, and then had to defend herself as he swarmed over her, licking her face and barking. So, when the dog jumped into Mrs. Humphrey's lap, Mrs. Humphrey was amazed and she exclaimed with amazement, oh, and then she had to defend herself. Defend means she had to protect herself as he swarmed, as he climbed over her, licking her face and barking. During the excitement, I helped the chauffeur to bring out the beds, toys, cushions, coats, and bowls, none of which had been used. So, this shows that no special treatment was given to Tricky. He lived like the other dogs in Mr. Harriet's surgery. As the car moved away, Mrs. Humphrey leaned out means bent her head out of the window. Tears shone in her eyes. There were tears in her eyes. These were tears of happiness. Her lips trembled and she said, "Oh, Mr. Harriet," she cried, "how can I ever thank you?" So Mrs. Pumphrey expressed her gratitude to Mr. Harriet and said, "This is a triumph of surgery. This is a victory of surgery." So that's all for this lesson, and I hope you've liked my explanation. So please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. Thank you.